Greetings and welcome to our panel titled After Sharm el-Sheikh, a Time of Reckoning for the Middle East. My name is Badr Saif. I'm an assistant professor at Kuwait University and a fellow at Chatham House and the Arab Gulf States Institute. We meet just 3 days after the proceedings of Sharm el-Sheikh. And I say proceedings because there is some labels competition over the proceedings. Was it a peace summit? Was it a ceasefire agreement? Was it a theatrical spectacle? Or was it a full political power on display while the real issues are still hanging? We changed the title of this panel, as you can imagine, a few days ago. The original title was 2 Years of War in the Middle East. And I think that title, too, doesn't do enough justice to the issues at hand. Yes, October 7 and the past 2 years have been horrific. October 7 witnessed the deadliest number of Jewish casualties since the Holocaust, and its aftermath witnessed the intensification, the continuation of the displacement, the dispossession, and the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. And we've seen this ongoing for decades. On the past 2 years, if we go by that metric alone, we're talking about a Palestinian child being killed every hour for the past 2 years. We're talking about the largest child orphan issue, crisis in modern history. We're talking about a man-made famine, the dehumanization of Palestinians, not only in Gaza, but also in the West Bank and beyond. And we're also talking about a headline that genocide experts around the world have come together and at majority level have said that this is actually a genocide as we are walking through it. So much has happened in the past 2 years, but I think the conflict can't be summed up in these 2 years alone. This is a decade-long conflict. It involves many parties. It's a story of occupation, sorrow, and many missed opportunities. So what does this moment today say about the Middle East, and how are we going to move forward with it? To unpack all of this, we have a stellar lineup of experts. We have Jalber Ashar, Emeritus Professor with the School of Oriental and African Studies, the University of London. We also have Meret Mabrouk, Senior Fellow and Founding Director of Egypt and the Horn of Africa Program at the Middle East Institute. We have Nathan Thrall, journalist and the 2024 Pulitzer Prize-winning author for general nonfiction. And we have Ali Vaez, the Senior Advisor to the President and Project Director for Iran at the International Crisis Group. So this is the game plan. I'll proceed with 2 rounds of questions, and each round will have a certain theme in place. My first theme will be the theme of continuity and change. Many people would declare that we are embarking on a new era in the Middle East, and we've heard this line in quite some time, a few times in the past few years and even decades. And some would say it's the same old. So we're going to be looking at it with that vantage point. And I'll start with Nathan by zooming in on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And by the way, if we can limit our responses to 3 to 4 minutes, I'd be grateful because of the time. Nathan, so congratulations on the life of Abd Salama, the novel that won the award. If anyone hasn't read it, I highly recommend it. And it's quite unique in offering us the day-to-day life of the Palestinians and Israelis on the ground. And my question to you is, keeping that perspective of the average person on the ground, how do you see the situation unfolding, and what really brought us down to this moment in terms of the fault lines between the two peoples?
Thank you all for being here. I actually want to start with a macro view in terms of answering where we are, and I think that a big part of the answer of how we got to this point is evident in what we have seen in the responses of world leaders over the last week to the Trump plan for Gaza. And what we see basically is that the absence of the worst levels of bloodshed is applauded by the world and treated as an acceptable situation, a situation in which states in Europe and the United States can have normal relations with Israel and can continue to I just want to note 2024, even prior to this Trump plan, 2024 was a year of record arms exports for Israel, with half of those going to Europe. And so what we have is that the whole world is willing to call this ceasefire, where Israel is remaining the occupying force of 53% of Gaza, continues to attack in the remaining 47%, just like we see Israel doing now in Lebanon, as Israel does in the West Bank. And everybody is embracing this, and not just Trump, and calling it peace. The Chancellor of Germany referred to it as peace, and many, many others. And to answer of how we got here is a lack of accountability, and how we got here is a whole world, particularly Europe and the United States, that are supporting a system of apartheid. And there is such eagerness to come and embrace Israel now. The EU is already announcing that they're going to walk back the very limited steps that they were beginning to take. The Eurovision Song Contest has announced that they're postponing the vote on excluding Israel. So everybody was just desperate to find a way not to hold Israel to account, which is a recipe for more bloodshed. And I guarantee that we will see much more bloodshed in the future, and I don't think any lessons have been learned. You know, part of the reason that I wrote this book was because I was so frustrated at how the world would only pay attention when there was terrible bloodshed in Gaza. And then the second it's finished, while it's happening, we must restore calm. What is the calm that they're asking to restore? It's a situation of subjugation of millions of people based on their inborn characteristics. And part of what we have to acknowledge is that Europe is telling the story to itself, the United States is telling the story to itself in order to justify embracing Israel, in order to justify treating Israel as a normal state. It's telling itself, oh, Israel is a democracy with a temporary occupation, which is totally at odds with the reality on the ground. It's telling itself that now we have peace when we don't have peace, because it wants to be able to continue with business as usual. And that is how we got here, and this is how we are going to continue to see a perpetuation of Israeli oppression and terrible bloodshed.
U.S. successive administrations do hold to this line, Nathan, you're right, but we're seeing a shift in the public opinion within America that's now acknowledging that there is a genocide in place, that's going out and protesting on college campuses. So that in itself is kind of a shift in the U.S. that we're not used to. Let's focus very quickly on the Sharm El-Sheikh summit.
Yes.
How would an average Palestinian and an average Israeli, someone that you'd encounter in your stay in Jerusalem, would look at this event and what it has transpired in the past few days?
So I think that, obviously there is tremendous relief at among Gazans at the fact that the worst of this killing has stopped, and they're now in a different phase. They're still killing. Israel killed 9 the other day after the ceasefire.
24 in total since the ceasefire took place.
Thank you. So, but there is tremendous relief, but I think it's also not sufficiently acknowledged how many people in Gaza also thought this was a really bad deal. And I'm not speaking simply of supporters of Hamas, because it's evident if you read it. I mean, this deal that all of Europe is embracing, it endorses the Trump 2020 plan, which is an annexationist plan for the opposite of a Palestinian state. It's a plan for Israel to annex all of the settlements and to give Palestinians, I mean, Bantustan is too good of a word for what the Trump 2020 plan envisions. And I just also want to note, this conference here has invited Gideon Sa'ar, the foreign minister of a state being investigated by the International Court of Justice for genocide. So this is emblematic of this desperation to embrace Israel, as soon as we have any excuse, the Trump plan is our excuse to host a foreign minister of a genocidal state? It really is very, very telling of the entire approach to Israel-Palestine, which is to be complicit and to deny European and American complicity.
Thank you, Nathan. I'll move on to Gilbert. And I want to look at the bigger picture. And I want to address this whole rupture continuity theme. How does it play out? And again, I'd like to congratulate you as well, because you also issued a book. Yeah, I mean, you're the author of many books, but this year's book is titled The Gaza Catastrophe, The Genocide in World Historical Perspective. So your ideas are quite clear on what has happened in the past 2 years, but I want to go back and look at not only the Israel-Palestine conflict, but the broader Middle East, and what kind of ruptures and continuities do you see in place?
Yes, thank you. Well, if I have to speak very shortly, I'd rather focus on the Palestine issue, because your question is very, very broad, basically. And I would say that first, when it comes to Palestine, it's a matter of successive betrayals of pledges. That starts with the 1939 British White Paper, promising us a single state in Palestine with proportional representation of the populations there. In 1947, the United Nations betrayed this pledge and opted instead for the partition, giving the Jewish minority a majority of the land. Then in 1949, the same United Nations accepted the 40% extension of that state, which ended up covering 78% at that time, before 1967. You've had 1967, when no decisive action was made to bring the two sides to a peace, and there was this possibility with the only, or let's say, the Arab leader with the highest possible popularity and legitimacy until now was still there, Gamal Abdel Nasser. That was betrayed. You had the 1993 Oslo agreements, and there was no pressure by Western countries. I mean, this is a history of Western betrayals, I should say. No pressure at all on Israel to stop the settlements, which of course led, I mean, the intensification of the settlement movement just jeopardized the whole thing and led it to the failure that we know. So you have all this on the one hand. You have on the other hand something which, in my view, is inherent to the nature of the project as it was born in 1948, which is the drift to the right of the Israeli state. In 1977, the Likud came to power, which is regarded as the far right of the Zionist movement. And it has been most of the time in power until now. And it has been shifting even further to the right with the latest Israeli government, that of Netanyahu, since December 22, involving the ultra-right. I mean, including a group that was banned as terrorist. I mean, the origin of which was banned as terrorist in Israel itself, not to mention Western countries. So, I mean, you have all this. Now, rupture, your second question. I would say we have today the combination of something that is far more intensive, I think, than even the Nakba of 1948, which was an act of ethnic cleansing. What we have today is a genocide. I think there is a large majority, put it that way, among those who work on such things to regard it as a genocide. It is, and you have at the same time something conflicting with that, which is a development of the Arab normalization with the Israeli state and that Israeli state. And therefore, what does it mean? It means that the gap between Arab regimes and the Arab public opinion is wider than it has ever been in history.
Thank you, Gilbert. And let me tell you, the Oslo process not only brought some self-limited rule for Palestinians and at times acting as proxies for the Israeli security apparatus, but also the intensification of the settlements happened in the 90s onwards. The red lines that we hear about when it comes to annexations doesn't look at the de facto annexation on the ground today. And that's something that needs to be tweaked and, detailed further. Thank you for that. I'll move on to Miret. And Miret, I want to look at our vantage point as, citizens, observers of the Middle East. We've always had this notion of how could, and it did, how could the Israel-Palestine conflict bring in a wider war, an all-out war? And we've seen bursts of it in the past 2 years, certainly. Now, if we were to choose one of the labels that I began the discussion with, I'll say a shaky ceasefire agreement, maybe, that we had 3 days ago, as of 3 days ago. Shaky and vague, I would say. So given that shakiness, fragility, and vagueness of what's on the table, where do we stand vis-a-vis other regional tensions? I'm thinking with the tensions bordering Gaza when it comes from Egypt and the demands that are being put there. I'm thinking of Yemen. I'm thinking of the encroachments of Israel on Lebanon and Syria that has become, daily news. How do you see all of this?
All right, thank you so much. There is a lot to say on this, and we don't have very much time, so I will say it is very difficult to keep a problem like this contained. And right at the beginning, what people were worried about was that this problem would spill its banks. Did that almost immediately. Because you have two reasons. One is physical. As time went on, the more, essentially, the more Israel was able to pound Gaza without any significant drawbacks or reaction at all, the more we could see that it was going to spill those banks. And then, of course, we had attacks on Lebanon, we had attacks on Syria, we had attacks on Yemen, without any significant, actually without any reaction at all. And the culmination of that came a couple of 3 weeks ago, quite shockingly, with the attack on Qatar. And nobody, including the poor Qataris, would have thought that an ally, a US ally, would be attacked by another US ally in a place that has over 15,000 US service people. So that was because nobody said no, and Israel just kept going. Now, you can say that Israel took the moment and was emboldened and thought, well, while we're doing this, we may as well strengthen our borders. But I think the encroachment went beyond all that. That's the physical spread. The other problem is what Gilbert alluded to. Government positions are not always the positions of their people. They're not. And in this particular case, if you talk about the governments of the region, these are not always governments that have particular democratic mores. There is a social contract. We keep you happy, and you don't ask for particular reforms. Now, whereas governments have had to stick to various relationships they have either with Israel or with Israeli backers, mostly the US, Arab populations don't have those constraints. And therefore, and especially the two countries that border Gaza, Jordan and Egypt, have come under extraordinary domestic strain because of this issue, and their governments are very worried about that. And very, very quickly, if we can say, you have two other issues that have come up. One is that in the Gulf specifically, the main threat is now not being perceived as Iran, but as Israel. And the last one, which I will just mention very, very quickly, is the relationship with the West. Because the region has watched what is happening. For everything that Nathan discussed, has watched what is happening. And the question is there an institutional, rules-based world order or not? And if there is it just for some people? And if it's just for some people, then why do you expect the rest of us to follow it? So there is enormous strain all over because of this issue. I don't think it's going to get any worse. And in the last 10 seconds, I will say that the ceasefire that you have alluded to, I know for a lot of regional governments, it was seen as a way of just stemming the bloodshed, but I don't think that's going to happen.
And it's a pity that we're looking at the bare minimum when we're talking about how the region can move further. And when it comes to the larger issues of peace, prosperity, security, stability, these are the themes that we're going after. But we're just looking at how can we safeguard our day-to-day events. This has been the reality of the region, unfortunately. And let me comment also on the Qatar attack, because I agree. I mean, this and I think many don't realize an attack on Qatar is an attack on the whole Gulf, the Gulf Arab states. That's how it's been conceived, and that's how it's been relayed to the rest of the interlocutors and the Gulf's partners for sure. But you mentioned Iran, Mirat, and we'll move to Iran with our good friend Ali. And Mirat has mentioned a very important point. I mean, everything that Mirat mentioned is obviously important, but I think when it comes to the Gulf and their shifting lenses, is Israel the main threat or is it Iran? I think we've been going back and forth answering this question. But certainly in the last 2 years, increasingly, Israel has, you guys have been competing for first place when it's either Iran or Israel. I think Iran has not been at that first place momentum for some time. The reconciliation that's been ongoing with the Gulf Arab states since 2021 and onwards, I think has been a good sign. But the Arab states have been the space for the shadow conflict between Israel and Iran for decades. I mean, I'm thinking Iran, I'm thinking the activities of some of the proxies in Lebanon, even the spaces of Syria, Yemen, some of the Gulf states. This shifted last year in 2024 in 2 episodes, in October and April, where we saw direct airstrikes. And then obviously the peak came last June with what became called the 12-day war. Now, looking at that moment, are we looking at a rupture in the way that Iran and Israel deal with one another, or is it a continuation of a different sort?
Great. Thank you very much, Badr, and thank you, ISPI, for bringing us to this majestic setup, even though it's not very well air-conditioned, but it's truly magnificent. Look, I think the past 400 days have witnessed the foundations of 40 years of Iran's national security doctrine completely shaking. If you think about the triad of Iran's defense doctrine, it's conventional defense, which were its ballistic missiles. Its regional defense, which were the axis of resistance, is the concept of forward defense, which were all supposed to deter a strike while Iran could get closer and closer to the possibility of having the ultimate deterrent, the nuclear option, have all kind of crumbled. Now, if you look, I mean, people put different numbers on what has happened, especially after the 12 days war. But I think a rough estimate is about 50% of the ballistic missile program was degraded. About 60–70% of the axis was degraded. And about 80% of Iran's ballistic missile was degraded. You can say the policy worked until Israel decided to adopt a forward defense policy of its own, which, by the way, I think predates Prime Minister Netanyahu, and it really started with the octopus doctrine that was put on the table when Bennett was Prime Minister. But it really changed the table and changed Israel's preparedness to take risks, bold actions, come from the gray zone into the light, and take it directly to the Iranians. I think the Iranians also committed several mistakes that then opened Israel's hand as a stronger conventional military power to use this plastic moment to weaken a traditional foe. But there's also another way of looking at this, and many in Iran are looking at that in the way that I would just describe, and that answers kind of your question about continuity and change. The other way of looking at it is 2 superpowers, one regional and one global, 2 nuclear powers, came to change the Iranian regime. They didn't manage. This was a short war, not because the Iranians wanted it to stop, but because the costs started accumulating very quickly. You know, the US used 1/4 of its TOD interceptors ever produced in 12 days. So imagine if this was 48 days, the US would not have any serious defenses against ballistic missiles if we would get into a war with China or Russia. So, you know, then there is this view in Iran that says, well, the nuclear program was degraded, sure, but if you ask me as somebody who's looked at numbers as a scientist for years and assessed Iran's nuclear program, if you had asked me before the 12-day war how long it would take for Iran to get a nuclear weapon, I would say less than a week for them to enrich enough uranium for a bomb, and then about 3 to 9 months. I have the same timeline today. So the pathway to a nuclear weapon is still open to the Iranians. The concept that Iran used to create this regional alliance, which was the pent-up frustration that Nathan was talking about, is still there. It's the material that Iran has worked with for years and still can cultivate. It takes time, it's not easy, but the option is not closed. And its ballistic missiles, in fact, it appears that they have already started recovering very quickly. Factories that were working 8 hours a day are now working 24 hours a day. And they are recovering relatively quickly. And so Iran is stuck between those who are saying within the system, in the debate in Tehran, that, you know, what we have done in the past 46 years has not worked. We were supposed to protect ourselves at a big price, at a price of isolating ourselves, sanctions, et cetera. And look how vulnerable we are. And those who say, imagine if we didn't have these capabilities. What would they have done to us 20 years ago, 30 years ago? And that debate is not yet landed on a consensus, and I think the reason is there is basically no good option for Iran at this moment, and nobody is giving them an exit ramp. And that debate kind of crystallized pretty well in how Iran reacted to the Sharm El-Sheikh summit, which I can talk about later.
Yeah, actually, I was going to go to that next, but everything that you've been saying is pointing us towards a second round of another war, unfortunately, and that will be my question to you in the next round. Iran has certainly been weakened, but inherently it's not weak, and I think that's what we're contending with. Very quickly on Sharm El-Sheikh, an invitation given out, a discussion that seems to have happened within Iran, and then the decision not to attend. How do you read the dynamic, whether from the invitee or from those that declined the invitation?
Yeah, so it was a huge debate, again, indicative of what I just said in terms of the broader strategic debate, between those who were saying, this is an opportunity to go and cater to President Trump's ego, which is what a lot of other leaders around the world have realized is the path to success. And those who were saying, the guy just bombed us in the middle of negotiations. 700 civilians died in Iran. We go and we praise him for a deal we truly don't believe will bring peace to the Middle East. And you could see even in the Iranian press the debate between those who were saying, go talk to Trump, resolve your problems once and for all in a comprehensive manner, not just about the nuclear issue, talk to them directly. And those who were saying, 70 plus members of parliament, 1/3 of the Iranian parliament, writing letters saying, develop a nuclear weapon. That's the best option to get Trump to treat you with the same respect he has treated North Korea's leader.
Thank you, Ali. I'll move next to Gilbert with my second round of questions. And here we're going to try to be a bit more reflective and to move towards the future. And Gilbert, I know you focused on Israel-Palestine in the first round, but I'll challenge you to the global dynamics now. And granted, we're living in a fragmented, insecure region, and some would say even in a global apparatus, as Marat alluded to as well, with the international order crumbling before our eyes. How do you see those broader global dynamics playing into the Middle East? What should we keep an eye on? How can we improve our lot as a collective region?
Yeah, thank you, Badr. Well, I'm sorry, but I'm obliged to start from the Gaza war because I believe it has, which is the subtitle of my book, which you quoted, a world historical significance, right? This was a really watershed in international relations, not the Gaza war only and in itself, but as the culmination of a process, a long process. You've had this huge discrepancy or even contradiction, one could say, between the Western reaction to Ukraine and the Western reaction to Gaza. And this contrast has never been so wide, especially in the so-called post-Cold War period, right? And the attitude towards the war itself, the Western support to the war, unlike, of course, the Western attitude on the Russian war in Ukraine, the attitude toward, for instance, the International Criminal Court's indictment of Putin and of Netanyahu, you have a range of questions where this contrast, the double standard, has been absolutely blatant, more than any previous time. And this led to a final discredit, I would say, of the so-called rules-based international liberal order. It has been totally discredited now. And whether the post-1945 promise or the renewed promise of post-1990, which led to, just mention two results of that, the responsibility to protect resolution at the United Nations and the creation of the International Criminal Court. And you can see how these two post-1990 products were completely disavowed by those very countries that were actually beyond these advances in international law. And let me stress that this is not due to Donald Trump. All this happened under Joe Biden, under the Democrats. And in some way, actually, Trump, or Trump 2, is a result of that. To a large extent, even Kamala Harris recently stated that his lack of empathy with what's happening in Gaza contributed to her defeat. I mean, even she was saying that. So we are today in a world that is ruled by if you can say, by the law of the jungle, you know, you have in the White House someone who believes that running the world is a business matter. And you have a big confusion between the Trump administration and the Trump organization. And hence also the interest in the Gulf countries, right? Because the Trump organization and the Trump administration here are completely inseparable. And this idea that trade will lead to everlasting peace for 3,000 years, as Donald Trump believed, is a complete illusion, a complete delusion, actually. He's completely delusionary about that. I think we all agree. I think we will see a continuation, if not actually a worsening, of the protracted destabilization of the Middle East that exploded for the first time in 2011. It's an accumulation of crisis. And look at the region. Look at Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, Sudan, Libya. I mean, we went from a region where you had a record number of uprisings, popular uprisings, big euphoria about democracy and all that, into a region which has a record number of civil wars and destabilization and, you know, everything. So this is extremely, we are going into very dangerous times, I'm afraid. And Europe, which is at the forefront of this Middle East, will bear the consequence.
Europe and the larger global community, I must say, and that's why all efforts need to be focused on resolving the root issues to all of this, which is occupation in Israel and Palestine, and addressing the grievances of the many peoples that you've mentioned in these different countries, which makes me move to you, Miret, when it comes to how to look at what's happening in the Middle East and conceptualizing how Arab-Israeli relations are moving forward in terms of what some Israeli pundits, some observers probably in the West would claim as an Israeli hegemony in the region. And I would beg to differ because I think hegemony brings, as it's winning hearts and minds, right? I mean, and I don't think we've seen any winning on that front from Israel. Bullying its way through in the Middle East is certainly no solution to resolving the issues. But with what's happening in the last 2 years, this emboldened Israel on display. How do you evaluate Arab-Israeli relations now and moving forward?
I think we need to take a look at the difference between hegemony and bully power, all right? Because it's possible that Israel views them as the same thing. Certainly for the Arabs, and again, I hesitate to use the word Arabs because the region is not hegemonous. The region has different states who have different relations and have different considerations. There are Arab countries that are going to be significantly more comfortable with Israel than others. And I will put geographic proximity here. The closer you are to Israel, the more likely it is that your populations are going to be significantly more worried about Israel. Okay? Now, again, the attack on Qatar moved that line significantly further out because, again, I mean, Emiratis and Qataris and Kuwaitis weren't actually worried that they were going to be bombed by Israel. But, again, that has changed. Now, again, you need to take a look at governments and people. Israel is close to the United States, and there are many countries, particularly in the Gulf, that are most interested in tech and AI at the moment, and this is where they're leaning, and this is where they're going to head, all right? Which is why I think there was such an eagerness to accept this quote-unquote ceasefire. On the one hand, yes, less Palestinians will be killed. On the other hand, I personally think that really you are kicking the ball down the road, and this is going to happen again. But for everyone else, the idea of normalization. Now, you want to bear in mind that Jordan and Egypt have had peace with Israel for a long time, Egypt since 1979. It is what is referred to as a cold peace. There is no people-to-people interaction, and that is directly linked to the Palestinians. All right? So the word normalization here, what does the word normalization mean? Does it mean that you have an embassy and that you have relations? Okay, fine, they might have that. But Israel will never be part of the Middle East, never be part of the Middle East, as long as there is no Palestinian state. And I think it just needs to realize that. That may not be something that is relevant to Israel at all. They may continue to say, well, we are in the Eurovision as a European country, and that's all we care about. I think down the road that is going to be seriously problematic. So normalization, I don't see in the immediate future, and even if you get a cold normalization, there will be no position for Israel in the Middle East while it continues to be an apartheid state.
Thank you, Mirat. Thank you. I'll move next to Nathan. And the genocidal aspects have ceased for now, for the past week, I would say. But the lingering feeling and impulse of violence and the trauma is still around us, and it will haunt us for a long time. How, in light of all of this, how do you see the future of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict? I mean, you've alluded to this somewhat in the first comment, but how can we move in a way that sustains a progressive movement toward equity to all sides involved?
So I think that, first of all, equity or equality is not at the basis of any of the European or American proposals for Israel-Palestine on purely objective grounds. the Biden administration began to introduce this language that we hadn't heard from the US before about seeking equal measures of dignity and security and freedom for both peoples. But and equality is so much of the discussion in Europe and the United States when people talk about Israel-Palestine. But the vision that's put forward is the antithesis of equality. So now everybody's embracing a Trump plan that has embedded within it support for the Trump 2020 plan. Again, the antithesis of equality. But even if we take like a good version of the two-state solution, where is the equality there? Where is the principle of equality? You have a single sovereign state, the state of Israel, controlling 7.5 million Palestinians, 7.5 million Jews. All those Jews have full rights, and the majority of those Palestinians don't have basic civil rights. And to propose as the solution for this is that the Palestinians will get a sub-sovereign state on 22% of the land. So half of the people under Israel's control, I'm not even counting millions of Palestinian refugees who aren't allowed to enter historic Palestine, neither Israel nor the occupied territory. Half of the people get 22% of the land, disconnected and not sovereign. So I think that if we want to talk seriously about equality, we need to have a discussion about actual equality. And there's absolutely no equality there. Or take the idea of Zionism itself. I mean, the idea of Zionism is that Jews have a right to come back to their ancestral homeland after 2,000 years. And again, so it's framed as a return. Zionism is framed as a right of return. And Palestinians, and this return, by the way, is not an actual return, it's a return to an idea. None of the Zionist settlers who arrived in Palestine could point to a home or a village or a town that they were returning to. They were returning to a concept of an ancient Jewish kingdom. So if you're a supporter of the two-state solution, and most in Europe are supporters of the two-state solution specifically in order to protect Israel's status as a Jewish state. It's not out of love for Palestinians, it's to protect Israel. It's to protect Israel from its demographic threat. And so again, to return to the concept of equality, Zionism is the idea, and everyone in Europe is supportive of this. Jews have a right to return to their ancestral homeland after 2,000 years. Palestinians don't have the right to return not to a conceptual, abstract idea, but to actual homes after 2 years or 20 years or 80 years. So again, the opposite of equality, these aren't principles that we hold in any other conflict. We don't say that, Muslims can retake Spain. We don't, reject the idea that refugees can return to their homes at the end of an armistice. It's only here that we have this inversion of the notion of equality cloaked in very pretty language that is Orwellian.
So very quickly, what would the solution be, Nathan? What do you propose as a solution if you don't like what's happening on the ground?
I'm very averse to talking about solutions because I think it's playing into a game that Israel likes very much. Mm-hmm. And that game is essentially, the real reason that we haven't had Palestinian freedom yet is because the right equation hasn't been found. When those negotiators have come and they've put a plan on a blackboard, and they've proposed, 3% swaps, but it should have been 5%, and they've, proposed this part will be annexed and not this part, and all of these ideas that, it's really confederation, that was really the answer, we hadn't been thinking about a confederal solution. It all plays into this notion as though Israel is ready to give the Palestinians their freedom and independence, if only we find the right formula, when the reality is there's one party with all the power, another party with none, and the party with all the power has zero incentive to give anything to the Palestinians. So what we need to be addressing is that differential in power. What we need to be addressing is the absence of an Israeli incentive to give Palestinians equality or freedom. In any scenario, 10 states, 1 state, whatever. And what that means is sanctions. And nobody wants to talk about that because, again, everybody in this conference basically is eager to avoid that. And as so long as we don't address that issue, all of this talk of 2 states, 1 state, confederation, what's the right solution? It's not the issue. It's not the problem of what's the right solution. The problem is the party who controls all the territory wants this apartheid to continue.
Thank you, Nathan. Sanctions and probably good US leverage. Thank you, Nathan. Sanctions and US leverage, real sustained US leverage, I would add. Ending with Ali, a coming war between the US, and I say the US, between Israel and Iran, with probable US backing. If that's the trajectory, how can we avert it? If we couldn't avert it, what would be the scenarios on the ground, and what can we do to minimize the costs?
Well, I was listening to Nathan and thinking that the Iran problem is the opposite. In Israel, you have all carrots and no sticks. In Iran, you have all sticks and no carrots, basically. And I told you about the debate in Iran about where to go from here strategically. One issue on which there is actually no debate is kind of the inevitability of another round with Israel. The view is Israel is not done. I talked about the fact that there's a pathway to a nuclear weapon in the very Shia tradition of Iran. There's 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium that has gone into occultation. There is, unlike the peace plan in Gaza, where you actually have at least a document, lots of holes in it, but sure, at least something is written on paper. In the ceasefire between Iran and Israel, there is no written understanding. The terms are not clear. It's not clear what would cross an Israeli red line, whether it would be a bulldozer showing up at one of these bombed sites and starting to clean up the rubble, or Iran developing a new kind of missile, right? We've already seen Bibi laying the groundwork by talking about Iran developing an intercontinental ballistic missile, threatening Mar-a-Lago, obviously speaking to an audience of one. But the reality is, I think Israel has every interest in trying to go back in and trying to not necessarily finish the job, but at least advance the project. And there is this view that, Iran might not be ripe for regime change, but it is ripe for regime destabilization. And that would result, there is already significant amount of discontent within the Iranian society. We've seen, people rise up against this regime 3 times in the past 5 years. And although there was a rally around the soil, I don't want to call it the flag, but the rally around the soil effect during the war. But there is a lot of discontent. And that's, again, the material that Israel can work with to turn Iran into another Syria, into another Iraq, into another Yemen, a country that is engaged in civil strife, so it's internally focused, and therefore cannot challenge Israel's project in the region.
Thank you, Ali. Please join me in thanking our excellent panelists.
Ladies and gentlemen, please, for some security checks, we kindly ask you to leave this room. We'll be back in a little bit with our special dialogue at 5:45. Signori e signori, per motivi di sicurezza, per un breve check della sicurezza, vi chiediamo cortesemente di lasciare questa sala.